Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, researchers Twomey and Nicky Byrne give insight into the Dairy Beef Index, the economic benefits for both dairy and beef farmers and the scope for greater use of the index in dairy herds.
So the Dairy Beef Index, or also known as the DBI, was published in 2019. This index was developed to identify beef males suitable for dairy cows, which were easy calving and short gestation, but also good for carcass traits to provide superior calves to the beef industry. So this was made up similarly to the EBI, which included traits that were based on economic importance for both the beef and the dairy industry. And there's approximately about 50% of the traits for dairy farmers and 50% of the traits are for beef farmers. And these traits for dairy farmers include calving ease, gestation length and mortality. And then for the beef farmer, there's traits such as carcass weight, carcass conformation, and then docility and feed intake.
Looking then, Alan, to usage on farms, you mentioned that it began on farm in 2019. Have you seen evidence of the usage of the DBI bulls increasing over time?
So yes, we have. So it is a relatively new index, as we all know, and it takes time for people to adopt new things. But we have seen that this spring, bulls were €16 higher in the DBI compared to, we'll say, the spring of 2018, which was the year before the introduction of the Dairy Beef Index. I suppose what this means is this €16 increase means is that progeny from beef bulls this year are going to leave €16 more, each calf's going to leave €16 more value to both the dairy and the beef industry.
And to you, Nicky, why is it important that we would place emphasis on high quality beef when we're producing non-replacement dairy stock?
Yeah, so it is of fundamental importance that we focus on improving the quality of the beef animals coming from the dairy herd. And one of the main reasons is because we've seen an increase in the proportion of animals of dairy origin that have been slaughtered through Irish meat plants. And currently that number is at about 57% of total cattle processed are of dairy origin. And if we look back to quota times, I suppose pre-2015, we would have saw that suckler animals predominated the market, equating to over 50% of the national kill. So that has changed somewhat over the last number of years. And I suppose on the back of that increased dairy influence, we have seen a reduction in carcass conformation. And ultimately that has led to a higher percentage of dairy beef animals failing to meet minimum carcass specifications for carcass conformation. And that is a serious price implication on the value of that overall carcass.
And if we consider what we've heard from Alan in relation to DBI usage, it has increased, albeit it's in its early stages and infancy. In your opinion, Nicky, what percentage of dairy herds could be targeted for use with DBI sires during the breeding season?
Well, if we look at the current figures, we know that about 50% of dairy cow calf registrations are to a beef sire. And we know that this has significant scope to increase going forward. And I suppose what will allow us to increase the proportion of beef calves coming from the dairy herd will be improving fertility of the dairy herd. And I suppose we have a good opportunity now that maybe herds aren't expanding at the same rate as what they were post-quota, that we can focus on increasing the amount of beef usage on the dairy herds. And I suppose we've improving technologies as well that can be used on that more fertile herd, such as sex semen. And I suppose where that is used effectively on the right herds, we know that we can increase the amount of beef calves registered in that herd up to 70% of the total calvings across the herd. So there is significant scope there to increase the number of beef calves. And in doing that, you'll probably increase the selection intensity in your dairy breeding program and probably create a better herd of cows going forward. So beef really does have a role to play in terms of improving your farm efficiency, the quality of your herd, as well as maintaining the credentials of Irish dairy production and also producing a high quality product to further improve our beef industry. And dairy beef, it can be a very, very high quality product. Typically, we're capable of producing dairy beef animals from our dairy herd that are suited to grass-based systems, and that can produce an on-spec carcass at probably younger ages of slaughter due to their ability to mature at earlier ages.
And to you, Alan, the biggest concern I would hear from dairy farmers, are will calving difficulty increase if I use the DBI, or is there a situation where the calving interval on farm is going to increase when I'm using my DBI bull as opposed to using the conventional and the norm of an EBI bull? To you, if we could look in real terms, do you see an increase in calving difficulty in cows that have calved down using a DBI sire relative to the EBI?
So yes, that would be a concern, but I suppose on average it is relatively small. So yes, majority of beef bulls will provide a slightly harder calving and a longer gestation than your EBI bulls, but I suppose the DBI, and as I said, includes calving difficulty and gestation length, and there is a large emphasis on selecting those beef sires. And I suppose we can see that in studies that we've done, that on average, that a high DBI bulls are only 0.5% higher calving difficulty than your ordinary, we'll say, your average Holstein-Friesian bull, and 3 days longer in gestation length. And I suppose this would be relatively small for the extra benefit that you'll be getting for your beef calf. So you'll be getting a higher value for your calf, and also that calf will be a superior value to the beef farmer, and therefore it'll be easier to have more saleable calves in future years, because those farmers will come back year on year for those beef calves.
And that 0.5% in terms of calving difficulty, did that follow on, in terms of registration? Was there an increase in the level of assistance required for those calves, or was it similar to what you would expect in a normal year?
Let's say on average, that's kind of what you would get from a beef bull over your dairy bull, we'll say. So we'll say when we compared high dairy beef index sires compared to, we'll say, your standard beef bulls that were previously used, and these beef bulls were just solely focused on calving and gestation. And we saw between these two bulls that there was a 1% unit difference in calving difficulty and 1 day different in gestation length. So yes, there is a small increase in your calving traits for your dairy beef index bulls relative to, we'll say, your previously beef bulls been used in dairy herds that were selected solely based on calving and gestation length. But again, this difference is really small in the larger scheme. And I suppose I'd also like to add there, and what I'd be kind of advising to dairy farmers that are kind of concerned about the calving difficulty, is that all these bulls have a calving difficulty figure available to them. So and I know farmers have this threshold, whether it's 4% or 5%, that they can pick within that threshold. And then let's say if they pick within a 4% threshold, that within that 4% threshold on their calving difficulty figure, try to aim to select the higher DBI bulls. So you'll get you'll get no difference in calving difficulty, but the calf will have superior beef merit rather than bulls with a lower DBI at the same calving difficulty.
And then from the perspective of the beef producer, Alan, what are the measured benefits that you would see from the beef side of things in relation to carcass weight and carcass conformation?
So as Nicky had already said, was these superior genetic calves are a high value to the beef industry. So I suppose that beef farming is generally a small margin, and that the extra little performance that they're getting from these improvement in genetics is really increasing the sustainability of their system. And I suppose what we've seen here compared to your average EBI sire compared to your top DBI sire, calves are these progeny will get into carcass weights with almost 10 kilos heavier and 2 grades higher in conformation score, and almost 40% more animals reaching the specification, as Nicky has said. And these little metrics may all seem small, but these are a huge value to the beef farmer for each individual animal that they take to slaughter.
I guess from the perspective, when we talk about beef producers, would this include dairy farmers, Alan, or is this just, a beef benefit?
No, looking at the national data set that we can see there is many dairy farmers actually carry their own non-replacement stock to slaughter. Approximately 13% of dairy herds are finishing their own majority of their own beef cattle. So there's a huge benefit in those farmers also using the dairy beef index, because they're actually getting the increased value of the beef merit at the other side.
And to you, Nicky, you're working with a cohort of these non-replacement calves, with your research at Teagasc Grange. Can you briefly give us some insight into the groups of animals that you're working with?
Yeah, so I suppose we're looking at high EBI Holstein-Friesians, and I suppose we're comparing those high EBI Holstein-Friesian genetics to our Aberdeen Angus genetics that we've identified to be of high and of low carcass merit in terms of weight and conformation. But the Anguses that we looked at, they were the most commercially relevant Anguses that were used extensively across the Irish dairy herd. So they did offer your easy calving and short gestation lengths, and we picked the most divergent animals within that cohort in terms of carcass weight and conformation. And then we assemble those and assign them to their own systems and look at their overall contribution to farm system performance as a result of their differing genetic abilities. And I suppose probably as we'd expect nearly, we didn't see massive difference between the two Angus groups. We did see a 5 kilo advantage for the higher merit Angus and a slight increase in the carcass conformation of those. And that ultimately led to higher overall system performance and a higher carcass value. But I suppose the main differences that we do see is when we compare our Anguses to our Holstein-Friesians. And I suppose we achieve similar levels of carcass performance, 300 to 305 kilo carcass between our Friesians and our Anguses. But I suppose the efficiencies of that production is where they do differ. And we saw that although they achieved similar carcass weight, our Anguses were 1 to 2 conformation scores higher than our Holstein-Friesians. And that obviously led to a higher value per kilo of beef produced. But most importantly, we found that our Aberdeen Angus animals produced in the same type of production systems could be killed 1 month younger. And we achieved a lifetime forage input in those animals of 87% of their total lifetime feed requirements came from a forage source, be it grazed grass or conserved grass silage. And we only had to supplement those animals with less than 550 kilos of concentrate from birth right through to slaughter to produce that 300 kilo carcass grading O equals. So really those Anguses do show us what the potential is from the system. And because of that lower age at slaughter, it has serious implications on the farm system. And it resulted in an overall lower stocking rate. And that, could mean that we could carry more animals on that system, or we could have a lower environmental impact as a result of that difference in genetics. With the Holstein-Friesians, the main area of concern is the carcass conformation. So we're producing low value beef. We might produce the same quantity of beef, but it's of a significantly lower value than that of our beef animals. And when we look at, combined approach, looking at the difference in carcass value of the animals that we compared and the differences in feed costs of the systems, our Angus animals across both groups that we assessed were probably worth 150 to 160 euros more per head than our Holstein-Friesian animals. So that is the challenge that we must take up, is to try and convert our low value dairy males into beef cross animals, be it continental breeds or Aberdeen Angus, and try and add more value to that animal. And I suppose from recent research conducted by the Department of Agriculture, looking at the attitudes of beef farmers in terms of dairy beef production, and that would have shown that there was a strong preference out there for farmers to purchase, a beef sired calf, be it Aberdeen Angus or Limousin. They were some of the most popular breeds, with a much higher preference than purebred dairy males. So I think if we can convert our low value pure dairy males into beef animals, it'll be of worth significantly more to the wider industry, and it'll also help increase demand for calves and get calves moving off farm at an earlier stage and more reliably year on year.
And I guess, the big figure that sticks out to me, when you culminate the comparisons and the benefits that you have observed within the Aberdeen Angus group, it's at 150 or 160 euro per head. Like, that has a massive implication for overall profitability of these beef systems. And to you, Alan, from a national on-farm data perspective, ye have seen benefits of using, higher DBI bulls. Nicky has observed it in a research setting at Teagasc Grange. We see that the DBI can benefit beef farmers with a minimal impact on dairy farmers. When we think about different, I suppose different aspects of systems, you can say management has a huge impact. To you, from a dairy beef perspective, how much can genetics account for the benefits that you're seeing?
So I suppose the benefits that we're seeing and what Nicky has described up in Grange is actually purely genetics. Is all those benefits are due to genetics, because management has been equal. So in the national data set, when we're comparing animals within a similar management, and also as Nicky he's comparing animals managed in the same system. So therefore, all the benefits that we've shown here are purely down to genetics and improving on higher DBI sires.
And finally then, Alan, we're looking to the future and future-proofing systems and the sustainability of both dairy and, in this conversation, beef farming. Looking to the future of the DBI, do you see the traits that you mentioned earlier as how the DBI will look in the future, or are there new traits that ye are considering for addition to the DBI, or ones that you plan to look at in the future?
So yes, very similar to the EBI, the DBI will evolve over time with new traits coming on. And I suppose the next big trait that is that age of slaughter. And Nicky has already mentioned on how important that is at farm level. And I suppose age of slaughter is one trait that's really important at farm level. So there's less days of feed, but also will be really important going forward for our climate action plan. So the less animals, our lower age of slaughter animals have a lower environmental impact. So the first national evaluation for age of slaughter has been done, and this is currently being introduced into the ICBF pipeline and should be published and be available to farmers in the near future. I suppose other traits that we see coming down the line would be, and it's already available as a single trait, is meat quality. And then we can see, as I mentioned, the climate is methane, and there's work going on in Moore Park with green feed machines and that. And in Tully and in Grange, this data has been collected on how much individual animals are emitting of methane. And in the future, we could see a trait where animals will be selected based on animals with a lower methane output for the same milk yield, or even the same meat yield, that they'd have a lower methane production.
This has been a really interesting conversation. I think the scope for the DBI and the use of the DBI has huge potential on dairy farms. As you pointed out, Nicky, that 70% of our dairy cows have the potential for a beef sire, particularly with improved fertility and reproductive performance on farms. All equally pointing out, to you, Alan, pointing out the saleability of higher DBI animals and their ability to command a higher price for dairy farms, and not forgetting the point that a good percentage of dairy farms are retaining beef calves on farm above 12 months and also 13% to slaughter. So there's a significant role for DBI, and people can be more proactive in its use to increase farm profitability on a dairy farm, and also then looking to the beef farm. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Nicky.
Thank you, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Alan Twomey and Nicky Byrne for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.